He didn't kill them in a moment of madness. He killed them for the money, and the most chilling part, the proof wasn't found at the crime scene. It was locked in a basement safe, signed just 48 hours before the murders. He didn't kill them in a moment of madness. He killed them for the money. Those words, "Do not let him inherit a dime," no longer sound like an accusation or a bitter remark. They read like a final warning, one written in fear and urgency, and discovered only after it was already too late. While the coroner carefully examined the devastation left behind in the master bedroom, documenting what violence had done to a family once held together by reputation and love, another, far quieter investigation was unfolding beneath the house, away from the cameras and the headlines. In the basement office of Rob Reiner's estate, federal agents worked methodically, almost reverently, as they drilled into a concealed wall safe that had been deliberately hidden behind years of success, awards, and framed reminders of a celebrated career. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with the understanding that whatever lay inside could explain everything. They weren't searching for stacks of cash, weapons, or illegal substances. This wasn't about greed in the obvious sense. It was about motive, the why that transforms a tragedy into a calculated act. When the safe finally gave way, what emerged wasn't dramatic in appearance. There were no jewels, no secret fortunes. Instead, there was paper. But this wasn't ordinary paperwork or forgotten legal clutter. It was precise, it was recent, and it carried weight far heavier than gold. In that moment, investigators realized they weren't holding evidence of chaos or mental collapse. They were holding proof of intention, a deliberate decision that had set events in motion, quietly, irreversibly, and with deadly consequences. Inside the safe lay a single document, unassuming in appearance, yet devastating in meaning. There were no stacks of paperwork, no folders filled with decades of records, just one page, carefully placed, pristine, and chillingly recent. It was a codicil, a formal, legally binding amendment to the last will and testament of Rob and Michelle Reiner. The kind of document people draft only when something has fundamentally changed, when urgency replaces hesitation and time suddenly feels scarce. The paper showed no signs of age or uncertainty. The ink was sharp. The margins were clean. This wasn't a forgotten revision or a routine update. It had been prepared with intention, reviewed with care, and hidden with purpose. Whoever placed it in that safe knew exactly what it meant, and exactly what it could trigger if discovered. Then the investigators saw the notary stamp. December 12, 2025, a Friday. The room fell silent. That date hit like a physical blow. It meant the amendment had been signed just 48 hours before the murders. 2 days, 1 weekend. Barely enough time for emotions to cool, for consequences to be absorbed, or for conversations to be had. This wasn't history resurfacing. It was a decision made at the very edge of catastrophe. In that instant, the entire case shifted. What once appeared to be a long-simmering family breakdown now revealed a sharp inflection point. The murders no longer looked like the tragic climax of years of dysfunction alone. They began to resemble a reaction, immediate, explosive, and calculated. The timeline snapped into focus, and with it came a chilling realization. Whatever this document changed, it changed everything. For decades, the basement had been Rob Reiner's private creative sanctuary, a space untouched by the noise of Hollywood and the expectations of the outside world. It was where scripts were first opened and read with quiet focus, where edits were debated line by line, and where ideas were sharpened into films that would define generations. Within those walls, the foundation of Castle Rock entertainment took shape, not through spectacle, but through patience, craft, and deliberate thought. This was where Rob retreated to think clearly, to build something lasting, to leave behind a legacy rooted in storytelling rather than excess. But on that Sunday night, nostalgia had no power. The awards lining the walls, the framed posters celebrating decades of success, all faded into irrelevance. Investigators weren't there to admire a career or preserve a myth. They were tracing the financial heartbeat of a dynasty that had just collapsed in on itself. Every drawer, every wall, every locked compartment was examined not for memories, but for answers. And hidden behind fireproof steel, sealed away beneath layers of intentional secrecy, was the truth Rob Reiner had finally forced himself to confront. It was a truth he had prepared quietly, knowing it would change everything, yet when he never lived long enough to explain, defend, or soften. When legal experts were finally able to examine the amendment in detail, there was an immediate and rare consensus. This was not a routine adjustment, not a symbolic warning, and not a temporary measure designed to scare someone into compliance. They described it with a single loaded word: nuclear. In legal terms, it represented the most extreme option available, an irreversible restructuring meant to protect the estate at all costs, even if it meant severing family ties beyond repair. For years, Rob Reiner had resisted every warning from those closest to him. Friends who had watched the situation deteriorate urged him to act, to draw firm boundaries before it was too late. They saw the danger clearly: the unchecked entitlement, the dependency, the slow erosion of responsibility. But Rob refused to close the door. He kept the checkbook open, convinced that financial support was an extension of love itself. He believed that if he just gave enough time, enough patience, enough resources, his son might stabilize, recover, or at least survive. Money in Rob's mind wasn't indulgence, it was protection. The amendment proved that belief had finally collapsed under the weight of reality. Whatever hope Rob once held had been replaced by a grim understanding that unconditional support was no longer saving his son. It was enabling his destruction. This document wasn't written in anger. It was written in fear, exhaustion, and the painful clarity that comes when denial finally ends. The amendment didn't merely tweak the inheritance, it dismantled and rebuilt it from the ground up. Under its terms, Nick Reiner was effectively erased from the financial life of the estate unless he met rigid, non-negotiable conditions. There would be no cash distributions, no monthly allowances, no access to trust funds, and no control over properties. The only path back in required total compliance: a verified, long-term stay in a secure psychiatric facility, followed by at least 2 years of documented sobriety, monitored and confirmed by professionals. Anything less meant nothing. There were no partial rewards, no loopholes, no grace periods. If Nick failed to complete treatment, relapsed, or refused oversight, the inheritance didn't shrink or pause, it vanished entirely. The language was absolute. The door wasn't left cracked open for negotiation. It was sealed shut, intentionally and permanently. Rob Reiner had finally done what he had avoided for years. He chose the survival of his legacy over the illusion that love, unchecked, could fix what had already spiraled out of control. This wasn't cruelty disguised as discipline, and it certainly wasn't an act of abandonment. It was desperation, raw, exhausted, and born from years of watching someone you love spiral closer to self-destruction. Rob Reiner wasn't trying to punish his son or erase him from the family. He was trying, in the only way he still could, to save him. After countless conversations, interventions, excuses, and financial rescues, Rob had reached the end of every conventional option. What remained was the one form of leverage that had always shaped Nick's reality: money. To Rob, the decision was agonizing. He understood the risk. He knew this move could fracture the family forever, but he also knew the alternative was worse. His fortune had become a pipeline, one that fed addiction, insulated recklessness, and delayed consequences. Each check written in the name of love only extended the damage. By cutting off access, Rob wasn't trying to control his son's life. He was trying to stop financing its destruction. The amendment was meant to be a barrier, a forced pause, a moment where survival would finally outweigh comfort. In Rob's mind, this was the most painful expression of love he had ever made. He believed that if money stopped flowing, reality would take over. That Nick would be pushed, however unwillingly, toward treatment, sobriety, and accountability. The document wasn't meant to exile him, it was meant to corner him into choosing life. It was the last tool available to a father who had already tried everything else. But Nick didn't see it that way. To him, the amendment wasn't protection, it was provocation. It didn't feel like concern, it felt like betrayal. The safety net he had always relied on was suddenly ripped away, replaced with conditions that threatened his sense of entitlement. Where Rob saw a final lifeline, Nick saw a trap designed to humiliate and control him. In his distorted worldview, the document wasn't an act of love at all. It was an attack on his identity, his lifestyle, and his assumed future. What Rob intended as rescue, Nick interpreted as an act of aggression. And in that twisted logic, the amendment wasn't a plea for survival. It was a declaration of war. That discovery finally answered the question that had haunted detectives from the very beginning. The question that refused to go away no matter how many timelines were reconstructed or interviews conducted. Why now? Why, after nearly a decade of dysfunction, enabling, warnings, and unresolved tensio? And did the violence erupt on this exact weekend? Why not during one of the countless earlier arguments, relapses, or confrontations? Why this moment, this house, this night? The answer wasn't buried in psychological evaluations or hidden in the chaos of the crime scene. It was locked away in that basement safe, sealed behind steel and silence. Rob Reiner signed the amendment on Friday, making a decision that fundamentally and irrevocably altered the balance of power within his family. With a single signature, he drew a line that had never existed before, one that threatened everything Nick believed was guaranteed to him. Less than 24 hours later, on Saturday night, Rob appeared in public with his family at Conan O'Brien's Christmas party. To the outside world, it looked like a routine social appearance, another holiday gathering among friends. But to investigators, the timing was impossible to ignore. That party wasn't just a social event. It was the first moment after the amendment where the consequences could surface. Emotions were raw. Alcohol flowed. Tensions that had been quietly contained now had an audience and no escape. To detectives, this wasn't an unfortunate overlap of events. It wasn't bad luck or coincidence. It was a chain reaction. The signing of the document on Friday set the fuse. The confrontation that followed on Saturday night lit it. In their view, the violence that erupted afterward wasn't random or spontaneous. It was the inevitable result of cause and effect colliding in real time. Witnesses later described hearing raised voices cutting through the noise of the party, sharp, unmistakable, and deeply unsettling. Guests noticed Rob and Michelle Reiner's faces change in real time, their composure slipping, their expressions tightening with fear, shock, and humiliation. This wasn't the kind of heated exchange sparked by a careless comment or a professional disagreement. It wasn't about a movie role, a business decision, or a trivial social slight. Something far more personal and far more dangerous had surfaced. The tension followed them through the room like a shadow, and at its center was the secret buried in the basement. For the first time in Nick's life, Rob Reiner had drawn a line that could not be crossed. He had spoken the word that destroys entitlement at its core. No. Perhaps he told Nick the trust was locked. Perhaps he made it unmistakably clear that the money was gone unless real change happened. Maybe he said the words that finally stripped away the illusion of guaranteed support. You get nothing until you get clean. To a stable, grounded person, that moment could serve as a wake-up call, a painful but necessary confrontation with reality. It might inspire reflection, accountability, even growth. But to someone with narcissistic traits, it lands very differently. It isn't received as guidance or concern. It is experienced as annihilation. The refusal doesn't register as love with limits. It registers as an existential threat, an attack on identity itself. Psychologists have a specific term for moments like this, moments that don't merely hurt the ego but fracture it at the core. They call it a narcissistic injury, a psychological rupture so destabilizing that it overrides logic, empathy, and self-control all at once. It occurs when someone who has built their identity around entitlement and unconditional validation is suddenly confronted with a boundary they cannot bend. In that moment, reflection doesn't emerge and humility doesn't follow. Instead, the mind reacts as though it has been attacked. Nick didn't feel embarrassment or guilt. He didn't experience shame in the way a healthy person might. What surged through him was a sense of being robbed. In his distorted perception, something that was already his, something he believed he was owed, had been taken away without consent. The emotional and financial pipeline he had relied on for years, the endless ATM of unconditional love and support, had finally been shut down. That shutdown wasn't merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic to his sense of self. The privileges he assumed were permanent were suddenly conditional. The lifestyle he believed was guaranteed was now threatened. And in that realization, panic and rage fused together. The illusion that he could live without consequence collapsed. The system that had protected him from accountability was gone. The free ride wasn't just ending, it had already ended, and in his mind, someone had to pay for it. The drive home from the party must have felt suffocating, heavy with silence and unspoken fear. One can imagine the tension filling the car, every mile stretching longer than the last. Rob and Michelle likely believed they had finally crossed the hardest threshold, that the confrontation, as painful as it was, had been necessary. In their minds, telling the truth was the beginning of healing. They may have told themselves that anger would fade, that time and distance would soften the blow, that their son would eventually understand why this line had to be drawn. They probably believed the danger had passed simply because the words had finally been said. But Nick wasn't processing emotion. He wasn't reflecting, grieving, or wrestling with understanding. He was calculating. While his parents sat in the aftermath of what they believed was a difficult but loving decision, Nick was already running the numbers. In his mind, the equation was brutally simple. If his parents remained alive, the amendment would stand, and his financial future would collapse. He would be cut off, stripped of access, forced into conditions he neither wanted nor believed he needed. But if his parents were gone, the situation changed. The will could be challenged. The amendment could be contested. The clock could be turned back. That is the precise moment where the motive shifts. What may have begun as an emotional confrontation hardens into something far more dangerous. The The narrative moves away from anger and wounded pride and enters the realm of cold, terrifying logic. This was no longer about feelings or family conflict. It was about survival as Nick defined it, financial, personal, and absolute. And once that calculation took shape, the path forward became horrifyingly clear. If Nick knew about the amendment, and all signs suggest that he did, but believed it hadn't yet been fully secured, filed, or made legally untouchable, then the murders take on a horrifying clarity. And even if he understood the risks, he may have believed he was smarter than the system, that he could outmaneuver the law the same way he had outmaneuvered consequences for most of his life. In that mindset, time wasn't neutral. It was an enemy. Every hour that passed increased the chance that the amendment would become permanent, enforceable, and impossible to undo. Seen through that lens, the violence no longer looks impulsive or fueled by blind rage. It becomes calculated. Nick wasn't killing them because he hated them. Hatred implies emotion, attachment, and loss of control. This wasn't that. He was killing them to stop the ink from drying, to interrupt the legal process before it could lock him out forever, to reset the board while there was still a chance to reclaim what he believed was already his. In his mind, this wasn't destruction, it was strategy. A brutal, irreversible move designed to eliminate the only obstacles standing between him and financial survival as he defined it. The amendment threatened his entire future. The murders were his attempt to erase that threat before it became permanent. Under California's Slayer rule, the guiding principle is straightforward and deeply rooted in moral logic. No one should ever be allowed to profit from the life they have taken. A person who intentionally and feloniously kills another is legally barred from inheriting from their victim. The rule exists to prevent the most fundamental injustice imaginable, the transformation of murder into a financial gain. In most cases, once intent and guilt are established, the barrier is absolute. The killer is treated, for inheritance purposes, as if they had died before their victim. The estate moves on without them. But beneath that seemingly solid foundation lies a dangerous fault line, one that legal scholars know well and defense attorneys know how to exploit. Everything hinges on a single word: intent. The Slayer rule is not triggered by the act of killing alone. It requires proof that the act was both criminal and deliberate. Remove intent, and the rule begins to unravel. This is where the insanity defense becomes pivotal. If Nick Reiner is found not guilty by reason of insanity, the legal framework shifts dramatically. The killings are no longer classified as intentional criminal acts. Instead, they are reframed as the tragic result of severe mental illness, a medical collapse rather than a moral choice. In the eyes of the law, a person found legally insane at the time of the act is considered incapable of forming intent. There is no malice, no conscious decision to commit a crime, and therefore no felonious wrongdoing as the statute defines it. Once intent disappears, so does the certainty of the Slayer rule. The safeguard designed to protect victims from posthumous exploitation suddenly becomes conditional. The killings may still be horrifying, irreversible, and real, but legally, they exist in a gray zone where criminal responsibility and civil consequences no longer align. In that space, an unthinkable outcome becomes possible. A person could avoid prison by being declared insane and still retain the legal right to inherit from the very people they killed. What was meant to be an iron moral boundary turns into a loophole large enough to swallow justice itself. That is the nightmare scenario, the one that makes even seasoned legal experts uneasy. Instead of spending his life behind prison walls, Nick could be transferred to a psychiatric hospital, framed not as a criminal but as a patient. On paper, it would be described as treatment. In reality, it could become something far more comfortable than punishment. With continued access to estate funds, his legal team could petition for his transfer out of an overcrowded state-run facility and into a private, high-security psychiatric institution. These are not bleak hospital wards. They are controlled environments designed for the wealthy, places with manicured gardens instead of barbed wire, private rooms instead of cells, therapy animals instead of steel doors, and round-the-clock staff trained to provide comfort as much as containment. The food is better. The privacy is real. The suffering is softened. Many law-abiding citizens will never experience the level of care such facilities offer, even in their healthiest years. And the most disturbing part isn't the luxury itself. It's the bill, because in this scenario, the cost of that lifetime confinement wouldn't be borne by the state or by Nick himself. It would be paid for by the estate, by the fortune built through decades of work, by the money earned by Rob and Michelle Reiner. In other words, the people he killed would be financing his care, funding his comfort long after they were silenced. The fortune Rob Reiner spent a lifetime building, earned through films like Stand By Me and The Princess Bride, stories that celebrated innocence, loyalty, and the power of human connection, could be slowly drained away year after year to sustain the life of the man who destroyed his family. What was meant to secure a legacy, to support future generations and causes Rob believed in, could instead be converted into a financial lifeline for the very person who shattered it. Every dollar would represent not just money lost, but meaning inverted. Even the strict sobriety trust Rob signed on Friday, his final attempt to impose boundaries where none had existed, would not be safe. It could be challenged in court, dissected line by line, and potentially overturned by arguments that Nick's mental condition renders its requirements unreasonable or unenforceable. Lawyers could claim that mandatory sobriety and compliance are incompatible with a diagnosis of insanity, transforming the amendment from a safeguard into a legal vulnerability. In that twisted legal calculus, everything flips. Sanity becomes a liability, a condition that leads to total disinheritance. Insanity becomes an asset, a gateway not only to avoiding prison, but to reclaiming access to wealth. The system begins to reward the absence of responsibility, creating a reality where the more detached a person is from accountability, the more they stand to gain. It's a logic so perverse it feels unreal, yet it sits squarely within the bounds of what the law might allow. For the surviving siblings, Jake and Raimi, the nightmare didn't end when the police tape was finally removed and the house fell silent again. It simply changed form. What followed was not relief or closure, but a grotesque administrative war, one fought with filings, motions, and court dates instead of sirens and flashing lights. Even as they were still processing their grief, they were forced into a race against time, scrambling to freeze the estate's assets before they could be siphoned away to finance the legal defense of the man responsible for the devastation. Jake, who had warned his parents for years about the danger Nick posed, now carries an unbearable burden. He has been thrust into the role of gatekeeper, forced to make decisions no brother should ever have to make. He must instruct attorneys to cut off the flow of money, to argue on paper and in open court that his own brother has forfeited his right to the family's resources. Each legal step is both necessary and corrosive, eroding whatever fragments of family once remained. Raimi's ordeal is even more visceral. As the one who discovered the scene, her trauma is not abstract, it is etched into memory. Yet she is being compelled to relive that horror repeatedly, not only in criminal proceedings, but in civil courtrooms where the focus is money, ownership, and entitlement. She must fight to ensure that Nick does not inherit the very house where she found their parents, that he does not gain control over the space forever stained by violence. For her, the legal battle is not just about assets or principle. It is about survival, about preventing the past from reaching forward and claiming the future as well. This isn't just a legal dispute playing out in courtrooms and filings. It is the final, irreversible severance of a family bond. Jake and Raimi aren't fighting for money, and they aren't driven by greed or revenge. They are fighting for dignity, for the right to ensure that their parents are not victimized a second time, this time through bank accounts, trusts, and legal maneuvering. What they are defending is the integrity of their parents' lives and the meaning of everything Rob and Michelle worked to build. As the layers of this case peel back, a darker and more unsettling portrait comes into focus. Nick Reiner cannot be understood solely through the lenses of addiction or mental illness. Beneath those explanations lies something more corrosive, the toxic extreme of entitlement. He didn't want to build a life of his own, to struggle, fail, and earn his place in the world. He wanted to inherit one, fully formed, unchallenged, and guaranteed. When Rob finally threatened to lock the gate through the amendment, Nick didn't interpret it as discipline or an act of love born from fear. He saw it as theft. In that warped internal logic, the money was already his, and withholding it was an injustice. From that perspective, the violence wasn't impulsive or chaotic. It was efficient. The murders functioned as a hostile takeover of the family assets, an attempt to eliminate the gatekeepers standing between him and what he believed he was owed. This isn't merely a legal dispute unfolding through motions and court dates. It is the final, irreversible severance of a family bond, a rupture so complete that there is no path back to what once existed. Jake and Raimi are not standing in opposition to their brother because of money, inheritance, or greed. They are fighting for dignity. They are fighting for the right to protect their parents from being exploited one last time, this time not through violence, but through paperwork, loopholes, and a checkbook. What is at stake for them is not wealth, but meaning. The meaning of their parents' lives, their work, and the values they tried to uphold until the very end. Every filing, every court appearance forces them to relive the loss in a new and cruel form. Grief is no longer private, it is procedural. Their mourning is interrupted by deadlines, arguments, and the constant threat that their parents' legacy could be reduced to a funding source for the man who destroyed it. This is not closure. It is prolonged suffering, sanctioned by process and law. As the layers of the case continue to peel back, a darker and far more unsettling portrait of Nick Reiner emerges. He cannot be understood solely through addiction, diagnosis, or psychological labels. Those factors may explain behavior, but they do not fully define motive. At the core lies something more corrosive, the toxic extreme of entitlement. Nick did not want to build a life through effort, accountability, or growth. He wanted to inherit one, complete, unquestioned, and permanently insulated from consequence. When Rob finally threatened to lock the gate through the amendment, Nick did not interpret it as discipline or desperate love. He didn't see a father trying to save his son. He saw theft. In his warped internal logic, the money already belonged to him. Withholding it wasn't guidance, it was betrayal. From that perspective, the act of cutting him off was an injustice that demanded correction. Viewed through that lens, the violence loses any appearance of chaos or impulsivity. It becomes disturbingly efficient. The murders were not an emotional outburst. They were a solution. A hostile takeover of the family assets, executed by removing the gatekeepers who stood in the way. In Nick's mind, this wasn't destruction, it was reclamation. And that realization is what makes this story so deeply unsettling. The horror wasn't born from confusion or madness alone, but from a cold belief that entitlement justified everything that followed. This understanding explains what so many people found unsettling in the aftermath. The eerie calm, the mundane shopping trip, the complete absence of visible remorse. There was no shock, no collapse, no outward sign of grief. Because in Nick's mind, he hadn't lost his parents. He had removed obstacles. The people who controlled the money, the house, the future, those barriers were gone. What others saw as an unthinkable loss, he processed as a problem solved. In that distorted internal calculus, their lives became a currency. He believed he could trade them for freedom, freedom from oversight, from conditions, from accountability. Financial freedom, personal freedom, a clean slate bought at an unforgivable cost. And that is where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable. Rob Reiner spent his entire life telling stories rooted in love, loyalty, and the belief that people at their core could choose goodness. His films celebrated friendship, innocence, redemption, the idea that human connection matters more than power or wealth. Yet in the quiet darkness of his own home, he was forced to confront a reality none of his stories ever prepared him for. He had to draft a legal document not to protect his legacy from strangers or predators, but from his own son. That document was never meant as a weapon. It was meant as a lifeline, a final, desperate attempt to save a life that was slipping away. Rob believed that if he drew the line firmly enough, love might finally win where indulgence had failed. Instead, the very act meant to stop the destruction became the trigger that accelerated it. The amendment intended to preserve life and legacy became the catalyst for his death. A brutal reminder that even the purest intentions can collide with something darker, colder, and beyond repair. And that leaves us with a question that cuts deeper than the violence itself. A question that refuses to sit quietly at the edge of this case. If a killer is deemed insane enough to avoid prison, should they still be considered sane enough to inherit? Should the act of taking a life, any life, automatically sever the right to every dollar left behind, regardless of diagnosis, defense strategy, or legal technicality? This is the point where the clean lines of the law begin to blur, where statutes and loopholes collide with moral instinct. It is the moment when justice and legality stop moving in the same direction, forcing society to decide which one it is truly willing to defend. This case doesn't just test a family or a court system. It tests the values embedded in the law itself. It asks whether accountability can be negotiated away through language, whether intent can erase consequence, and whether wealth can insulate someone even from the ultimate boundary, death. These are not abstract questions. They are real, immediate, and devastating in their implications, not only for this family, but for every family that believes a will is an act of protection rather than a potential trigger. So tell us where you stand. Leave your verdict in the comments, because somewhere right now, another family is sitting at a table, drafting a will in good faith, unaware that they may also be drafting a motive. Unaware that love, money, and fear can intersect in ways no document can fully con. Trawl, rest in peace, Rob and Michelle Reiner. May your memory be a blessing, and may your story stand as a warning long after the courtroom lights go dark. And that leaves us with a question that cuts deeper than the violence itself. If a killer is insane enough to avoid prison, should they still be sane enough to inherit? Should taking a life automatically forfeit every dollar, regardless of diagnosis? Tell me where you stand. Leave your verdict in the comments. I read them all. If this story challenged you, disturbed you, or made you rethink how money and family collide, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We'll continue following the trial, the money, and the legal battle unfolding behind closed doors. Because the truth should never stay buried in a basement safe. Rest in peace, Rob and Michelle Reiner. May your memory be a blessing and your story a warning.